African history, the missionary enterprise in Africa 1855 and 1914. The missionary enterprise in Africa 1855 and 1914. Following the activities and the reports of the explorers, many European humanitarians formed philanthropic or humanitarian groups with an aim of spreading Christianity to the vast sea of paganism in Africa, to combat the spread of Islam at the same time. It should be noted that Islam had spread to the Maghreb region, North Africa, i.e. Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya and Egypt. In the 19th century, there were efforts to spread Islam in western Sudan and Somaliland, i.e. Tanfal to Toro and Futa Jalan in Chad, Sudan and Somaliland. The East African coast had also been penetrated by Islamic influence by 1850. To the Christian world, Europe, the Islamic religion was spreading, thus the need to stop it was the driving force in the formation of missionary groups and sponsorship to do the work. Another aim of the missionary groups was to spread Western civilization. Many European nationalists believed that their civilization and culture was second to none and that it was their responsibility to spread this superior culture civilization to the lost privileged in the so-called uncivilized world, Africa, Asia and the America. The missionaries also intended to abolish slave. Reports have been made by several explorers about the untold suffering and horrors of slave trade. It's this suffering that aroused the humanitarian feelings and that steered the abolitionist movements. Although some Afrocentric historians strongly believed that the abolitionist movements were inspired by economic factors or reason, they argued that the abolition movement was a direct response to the Industrial Revolution, since human labor was no longer required in large quantities. In addition to the above, the missionary groups were directly or indirectly part and parcel of the colonization process. Many missionary groups flocked to Africa between 1850 and slightly before 1900. It is through their activities and the resultant outcomes that they have been regarded as the most influential European groups in colonial Africa. It is also believed that they had political hidden agenda, for they often involved themselves in the politics of many African societies, something that eventually cost the Africans their independence. In summary, objectives/aims/reasons for the coming of missionaries. They can be distinguished between religious motives, humanitarian motives, economic motives, political motives. Religious motives: desire to drop the influence of Islam with all its bad practices, the desire to eradicate African traditional religion, to spread Christianity. Humanitarian motives: the desires to abolish slave trade, the need to introduce legitimate trade, the civilizing mission. African history, the missionary enterprise in Africa 1855 and 1914. It is important to note that different missionary groups came from different European countries and belonged to different European sectors, despite the fact that they all belonged to the same Christian faith. These differences mattered a lot because it is against these that their interests were molded. As one German missionary put it, "I made Germany first and then a missionary," i.e. he promoted the interests of his country first and then those of missionaries. Among the many missionaries and missionary groups that operated in Africa were the following: West Africa, various countries. Nigeria 1842 West Line Mission at Baduri. The Church Missionary Society at Abioki to spread to Yoruba land. In 1857 the Niger Delta was founded under the leadership of Samuel Ajay-Crow. In 1846 the Presbyterians founded mission at Calabar. In Sierra Leone the CMS began its work in 1806 and by 1850 it had been joined by West Line missionaries who converted many Christians. In the Gold Coast the Basel missionaries operated from 1828 onwards. The Bremen Missionary Society in 1847. Other countries of operation of missionaries in West Africa included Sierra Leone, Liberia, Cameroon and Togo. Liberia, Benin, Gambia, Senegal. Individual missionaries included Bishop Ajay-Crow, the Reverend John Scott, Henry Townshend, Thomas Freeman, Walter Miller, Edward Bowen. East Africa. In East Africa there were various missionary groups, and some of them included the CMS, and they operated at Rabbi Empire in 1840 near Mombasa and Zanzibar among the freed slaves as early as 1863. The CMS also operated in Uganda in 1877, spreading to various areas of Uganda, and by 1912 they had reached Indige. They also established mission station at Tabora, Tanga and Ujiji in this same year. The Holy Ghost Fathers established themselves at Bagamoyo, the Umka and Zanzibar. Individual missionaries included Alexander Mackay, Sir Goldsmith, Rev. C. T. Wilson, Father Laudel and Brother Annans, Bishop Tucker Hannington. Central Africa. African history, the missionary enterprise in Africa 1855 and 1914. The Paris Evangelical Mission PEM. The CMS, among them Meshona and the Maitbell. White and Holy Ghost Fathers. Individual missionaries included Joseph Moffat and Matty Bluland, Francois Coillard and Mashonaland, Father Lawton, Mashonas/Iceland, Helmo in Below Zealand, Dr. David Livingstone, Bishop Mackenzie in Malawi, Bishop Tozo in Malawi, William Koji, James Sutherland. Southern Africa. In Southern Africa there was the Free Church of Scotland, a Paris Evangelical Mission among the Basuto, the Germany missionaries also operated in Namibia. The Dutch Reformed Church among the Dutch settlers. Students' research work. Write notes about missionaries in East Africa, West Africa, Central Africa and South Africa. Challenges/problems faced by missionaries in Africa. The missionaries were faced with the challenge of spreading Christianity to vast area in the shortest time possible to people that did not know how to read or write as required by their sponsors. Operating in a continent of diversity in terms of tribes or societies, cultures and traditions which made their work slow for it required determined persons to carry on. They also faced a problem of language barrier which made communication hard, and they had a challenge of learning their African languages as quickly as possible for their work to progress and to translate their work into local languages. Working among a vast sea of illiterates. The existence of other religions which were divergent and opposing to Christianity, and they included Islam. African traditional religion to mention but a few. The contracting ideologies or philosophies between African leaders and missionaries. The Christian ideologies like monogamy were contradicting from African ideologies of polygamy. Environment/natural constraints. They came from temperate lands which was not easy for them to fit into the climate patterns and foods of the African continent. They had to cope with African diseases and learn to eat African foods. Inadequate transport and communication facilities. The only form of transport during this period was human porterage, which made the spread of their activities slow down. Operating in hostile communities where they faced opposition even in areas where they had been accepted. And African history, the missionary enterprise in Africa 1855 and 1914. Lack of proper and adequate geographical knowledge about the territories in which they were to operate. This often delayed their work, as some turned out to be more of explorers than actually missionaries, e.g. Dr. David Livingstone. His impact and influence was more of an explorer than a missionary. Missionary groups who came to Africa understaffed, often comprising of 2 to 4 missionaries in the station, and in some cases they operated as individuals, e.g. Rev Moffat of the Sea, MS operated in Maple Island as an individual. David Livingstone of the Sea, MS, was another salient example. Such small numbers could not, and the task ahead of them. Factors that facilitated missionaries to carry out their activities. Vast financial resources, that is to say, they had the money to finance their activities, which they secured from their home government. The approach they used to spread Christianity was human and enticing, hence enabled them to get converts more easily. Their ability to break the language barrier which eased communication between the parties and understanding. They enjoyed moral and military support from their home government, and even financially supported. Even Frontline/Gold Coast missionaries were supported by the British in Maple Land by the CMS. Malawian missionaries were supported by the British Chartered Company against the Ngoni. The superiority of their European doctrine against the traditional religion hence got converts in the shortest time possible, e.g. people joined the bandwagon. The advanced technology they used, e.g. military, they had arms which the African did not have and admired. The opening of the interior by building roads facilitated missionary activities, e.g. the Uganda Railway Sekondi Conakry. Political stability in some African societies enabled them to carry out their activities, like the Paris Evangelical Mission in Swaziland and Sotho was successful. However, the political instability in some African areas also facilitated missionary activity. When they experienced civil strife, dictatorship, slave trade, slavery, they created fertile ground for Christianity. They saw hope in Christianity. The missionaries capitalized on these weaknesses. Internal African social weaknesses which the missionaries exploited, e.g. bad cultural beliefs, e.g. polygamy, killing of twins, human sacrifice, opportunities. Many African opportunities joined the missionaries for selfish interests, but unknowingly they promoted the missionary activities, e.g. Sorapalo Kagwa, Seme Kakangulu. Economic hardships, e.g. slave trade and its economic implications. Economically, slave trade had brought devastation of many areas that were raided, yet Christianity brought hope. Assistance rendered to them by some progressive African leaders like Mutisa I of Buganda, who, according to H.M. Stanley, invited the missionaries, Moshishu of the Basuto, Komo of the Ingwato, Leonik of the Lozi people, Kasagoma of Toro, Bishop Samuel J. Crotho of the Rubeland, who admired the European technology and way of life, and therefore thought that, by inviting them and supporting them, they or their societies would develop. Not forgetting Amachinga, the Ngoni chief. Role played by missionaries in colonization of Africa. In cause of missionary humanitarian and civilization work, they played a great role as agents of colonization in Africa. They were strong instruments towards the establishment of colonial rule in Africa, hence the assertion. The flag followed the cross, which means behind missionaries came politicians/colonizers, or missionaries came with a Bible in one hand and a sword in the other. African history, the missionary enterprise in Africa 1855 and 1914. Of evangelical enterprise, they appealed to their home governments for protection, which was followed by colonization of specific territories where the missionaries operated. Missionary role in signing fraudulent treaties. Missionary role in interpretation and propaganda contributed towards the colonization of Africa, like the role played by Bishop Tucker as an interpreter in the signing of Buganda Agreement. It is against this background that Sir Harry Johnston, a British representative in signing of the Uganda Agreement. Missionaries like Reverend Moffat in Central was also instrumental in securing their treaties for British government should not be left out. They involved in African politics like supporting one group against the others, hence creating puppet leaders. It is only Menelik XI of Ethiopia who refused to sign the Italian version and survived colonial rule. Missionaries participated in the intensive exploration of Africa which improved European knowledge about the continent. Krapp, Rudman and Livingstone, the pioneer missionaries in Africa, got heavily involved in the exploration exercise. There is no doubt that the travels of David Livingstone in East and Central Africa raised the European curiosity in the area. The reports of Krapp, Rudman and Earhart too led to the exploration of East Africa. The struggle to discover the source of the most important river was partly as a result of missionary activity like Livingstone's assertion that the Zambezi was God's highway to the interior granted an insatiable curiosity about the Nile and the Congo. Missionaries were also instrumental in the development of a cash crop economy, legitimate trade wherever they went. In a bid to provide an alternative to slave trade, missionaries engaged in pilot attempts and cash crop production, which in turn formed a basis for an export-import economy of Uganda. The crops produced were to remain key foreign exchange earners, though at the same time their production turned Africa into raw material, producing ground to imperial Europe and confined Africans to the land and not politics. And also due to the promotion of legitimate trade, in process, the missionaries paved way for the coming of their own traders who later formed trading companies and played an important role in the colonization of Africa. Through their evangelization missions, missionaries attacked and condemned African culture and customs as barbaric and satanic practices like polygamy, witchcraft, female circumcision, drawing away of twins, and deliberately sought reforms in African society, and this made the Africans to believe that European institutions were better. The reforms eventually led to a decline in the influence of African traditional religion. Shrines were replaced by churches while traditional leaders gave way for church priests and clergy. As a result, the individual Africans who became a Christian saw the reason for the existence in his or her relationship to God rather than to his or her family, clan or ethnic group. Also, resisting a missionary or any European for that matter was considered being anti-progress, and this weakened the African spirit of resistance, making things easy for colonialists. Missionary education created a class of Africans who served as an efficient instrument in the establishment of colonial rule. Like in Central Africa, Chief Lunica had attained some education from those schools. Seme Kakangulu in East Africa, who colonized eastern Uganda not for missionary but for colonialists, were all products of those missionary schools like Bishop Aji Crowther. Closely related to the above, missionary education system was responsible for a linguistic revolution in Africa. The products of missionary education would speak and write English, French, German, Dutch and their own local languages. Their study of languages removed the language barrier which would have disturbed the establishment of colonial rule. The missionaries also undermined the basis of traditional African authority. This was done by demystifying the powers of the then traditional leaders. In some societies where the king was the religious head with divine powers, these powers would be challenged. A case in point is Mwanga, the king of Buganda, whose authority was partly derived from his religious cultural functions. The coming of Christian missionaries in Buganda brought a division of loyalties between the Kaboka and the new faith. This created a group of Baganda that were ready to challenge the Kaboka and welcome colonization. Missionaries were involved in trade, and some missionary groups formed trading groups such as the Bosel Trading Company, which was formed by the Bosel Missionary Group in Ghana. In most cases, the missionaries and the traders could not easily be distinguished because they were similar in color, language and carried out similar activities. Missionaries of a given country excluded traders of other countries and welcomed traders of their even countries to establish trade monopolies which colonization later came to protect. African history. The missionary enterprise in Africa 1855 and 1914. Converts. In the end, the education missionaries introduced ideological wings of imperialism and trained people to play subordinate roles during colonial rule, that is mostly being houseboys/girls and clerks. Missionaries were forerunners of imperialism. They consciously or unconsciously facilitated infringement of colonial rule in Africa. In this role, missionaries facilitated the drawing of spheres of influence in their metropolitan government. They also formed chartered companies like the IB Company, GEA Company, CMS, where they also acted as the foot. Through their policy of conversion to Christianity, they embarked on intensive preaching and spreading of the gospel of Christ to the heathen. As a result, missionaries won supporters to constitute a new order, a new set of civilization, a new social outlook. In final analysis, the Christian's cross became an intimate bedfellow of the national flag by which Africa was then conquered. Closely linked to the above was the way missionaries spread their gospel word. They were two religions, i.e. Protestants and Catholic missionaries, who divided Africans on religious grounds, and so by the time of colonization, it paved easy because the Africans were divided and could not easily fight back to the missionaries or colonialists. This weakened the African unity and so could not fight the common enemy. religious divisionism. African resistances against colonialism was further weakened by disunity caused by religious factions like in Uganda in 1883–93. There were religious wars between the Muslims, Protestants, Wangereza, Wafaransa wars which led to a lot of instability, and by the coming of colonialists into Uganda, the Baganda natives could not unite against them because of these religious divisions. The missionaries aimed at stopping slave trade, and this necessitated uprooting it from the interior. This increased European penetration in Africa, and in so doing, Africa was open to European influence and later colonization. They established the original social and economic infrastructure which enabled colonialists to penetrate the interior with ease. These economic infrastructures, like roads, also facilitated the spread of colonial rule and colonization of Africa. Missionaries also pacified Africans. Those who embraced Christianity saw the white man as a good person, a judgment based on the hypocritical conduct of the missionaries. In some cases, the missionaries treated Africans or offered material goods like clothes, shoes, mirrors and guns. Every white man was then considered as God as a missionary and would therefore be welcome. This definitely facilitated colonization. Contributions of missionaries to the development of African states. The contributions were both positive and negative, and they included the following. Positive contributions. They preached and spread Christianity among Africans like in Maples/Mashonaland in Central Africa, Uganda in East Africa, Yorubaland, Sierra Leone in West Africa, etc. Established churches for the spread of Christianity. They improved the health sector through discovery of medicine like quinine and establishment of healthy centers. In Central Africa by the Livingstonian Mission at Malawi, Lovedale Mission, in East Africa, Muleko, Mengo, etc. They improved the education sector through establishment of schools. In Central Africa, Overtown School, Muwara, Amweda by Livingstonian Mission near Mantry Falls in West Africa, Fora Bay College, St. Gregory and Walsh Institute. They also established mission stations. In Central Africa, in Luzi Kingdom, south of Lake Nile by Umka, at Bruman by Reverend Moffat, and at Colobrio, in East Africa at Bagamoyo and Ujiji. They introduced and encouraged the growing of new crops and use of new methods of farming like cocoa, palm oil, groundnuts, cotton, rubber. African history. The missionary enterprise in Africa 1855 and 1914. They established modern transport and communication network like roads, railways, ports and harbours, telegraph lines. They introduced informal education that taught reading, writing, arithmetic. The education system also produced African elites that aided imperialism like Simekakagulu. They checked on the spread of Islam in Africa, especially West and East Africa. Promoted African languages like Yoruba, Igbo, Kru Tenni, Men, Creoles, Ngoni, Yao, fought against slave trade and introduced legitimate trade. They supplied European manufactured goods. They provided employment to Africans as teachers, nurses, interpreters, secretaries, which increased standard of living. They promoted urbanization in West Africa like Freetown, Abeokuta, Lagos, Accra. Led to emergency of independent churches. Established freed slave centers like in Sierra Leone and Liberia. Negative contributions. Led to colonization of Africa. Involved in African politics and antagonized African political fabric. To campaign African traditional religion. Led to religious wars. The education provided aided colonial administration. Neglected African technology like use of herbs/vocational. African response to missionary activities. The coming of missionaries to Africa and their subsequent activities was received differently by different African societies, communities and people. In other words, different African societies perceive missionary activities differently, and it is for this reason that their response towards Christianity varied. While some African communities responded positively accepted, others responded negatively rejected. The response, whether positive or negative, depended on various factors/circumstances and events in Africa. They include the following. Positive response. Some societies and African leaders accepted because of political reasons. They thought that they would gain military support from diplomatic alliances with missionaries like Moshish accepted Paris Evangelical Mission in 1868, Mudasawan Kasagam of Torah. There were those that accepted genuinely and were converted like Koma of the Engwater, who had 200 wives, dismissed all of them and remained with one. Some societies accepted in order to preserve their independence against African local enemies like the Fant, who feared Sant imperialism, Boer imperialism and freed slaves, Baganda, etc. Other people admired Western culture of civilization like Koma of Engwater, Fant, Baganda, etc. African history. The missionary enterprise in Africa 1855 and 1914. Negative response. Fear alarmed by the presence of those missionaries that their presence had the potential to disrupt their political and social order like George of Opobo, the Asante, Banyoro and others had strong attachment to traditional belief and cultures like missionaries appeared as devils because of the colour like among the Nandi and Yoruba. Loss of political independence, more especially among the Sebat and Jebel rulers. Others, particularly African leaders, were hesitant to accept Christianity because they feared to lose their prestige among their subordinates. Prestige was based on African beliefs and values, yet preaching of Christianity centered on undermining African values. Like many African leaders, were not converted. The desire to resist the abolition of slavery by slave trading communities. They rejected Christianity for fear of loss of their economic livelihood, e.g., the Yao and Ngoni slaves in East Africa. The influence of Islamic communities and people who had been Islamic considered Christianity and Christians as infidels. While some accepted because of natural calamities, others resented missionaries because they attributed the natural calamities to the coming of the missionaries. Some were politically/militarily strong, hence did not want any assistance, like Judge of Opobo, Asante and Banyoro. Traditional beliefs and interpretations, i.e., they believed that the colour of the whites was for demons like the Uganda, Nandi, Yoruba people. Fear to disrupt social order, like small gods of Musuk, Lubel, Mukosa among others. Fear to lose prestige, where they did not want to lose fame among their natives and subordinates, for they could not start criticizing them.